friends, random people on the subway, everybody is always surprised to learn that the rapper Drake and the actor Zac Efron are Jewish. I even hear people gasp out loud, like, Drake is Jewish? And when I ask people why they're so surprised, eventually many say that they think Drake looks too black to look Jewish, Zac Efron looks too white to look Jewish, and both guys look too buff and too handsome to look Jewish. In other words, these folks have really detailed expectations about Jewish skin, hair, eyes, faces, and muscles, but those expectations seem contradictory because many people also say they don't consider Jewishness a physical trait, but instead consider it a faith or religious practice. In fact, when these folks are processing their reactions to Drake and to Zac Efron, many are surprised to realize that they hold any physical stereotypes about Jews at all. And these reactions to Drake and Zac Efron capture wider contradictions in our society. On one hand, many people assume that all Jews have white skin, and so they overlook Jews of color like Drake. But many people also assume that Jews will have physically distinct traits like beaked noses that are different from the usual expectations of how white people will look. And these stereotypes about Jewish bodies are examples of racial antisemitism. Racial antisemitism means stereotypes that cast Jews as physically different from and inferior to the dominant majority, for example, white Christians in the context of the US. Racial antisemitism is one kind of antisemitism. Other kinds of antisemitism focus on other tropes and stereotypes, like anti-Semitic conspiracy theories accusing Jews of controlling the media or the economy. But when we see bodily stereotypes about Jews, that's racial antisemitism. These anti-Semitic racial stereotypes descend from over 800 years of stigma in the arts, theology, law, and racist pseudoscience. And because of these stereotypes, some societies in the past have defined Jews, even Jews with white skin, as a distinct race, often imagined somewhere in between white people and people of color. And the best known example is how the Nazis defined Jews as a distinct and alien non-European race. And even in the US, Jews were often imagined as a distinct race until about the 1950s. Now, since the 50s and 60s, Americans have more commonly defined Jewishness as a religion and more commonly classified Jews with white skin as racially white. But this change has not magically erased 800 years of anti-Semitic racial stigmas. These racial stigmas still shape everyday assumptions in our society, even for people who don't consciously think of Jews as a race. And those assumptions are why so many people find Zac Efron's light complexion, his button nose, and his impressive muscles un-Jewish looking. It's also why so many people find Drake's muscles, and not just his skin color, un-Jewish looking. It's important to understand how anti-Semitism can show up as these stereotypes about Jewish bodies, and how those stereotypes intersect with various skin colors, like black skin and white skin. When we don't understand these links, we have trouble noticing and responding to anti-Semitism. For instance, we can get a false impression that you either have to care about anti-Semitism or racism, but can't care about both at once. And this false impression can lead to ignoring Jews of color, rather than addressing how racism and anti-Semitism intersect in their lives. Likewise, this kind of either-or thinking can lead to describing Jews with white skin as either totally privileged or totally oppressed, rather than recognizing how anti-Semitism and white privilege intersect in their lives. For example, among Jews with white skin, there can be a fear that addressing white privilege or racism within Jewish communities could lead to trivializing their experiences of anti-Semitism. And this mentality can lead people to claim inaccurately that Jews can't possibly experience white privilege because they face anti-Semitism. On the flip side, some non-Jews fear that addressing anti-Semitism could mean letting Jews off the hook from addressing their white privilege. So in some conversations about discrimination, people dismiss anti-Semitism altogether by saying things like, Jews are just white people and there's nothing more to say about it. Or saying, anti-Semitism isn't a real problem and Jews who say otherwise are just whiny white people trying to dodge white guilt. And these are false binaries. To get past them and really understand our society, we all need to better see how racism, racial anti-Semitism, and white privilege are always happening simultaneously around us. Rather than just picking one problem and denying the others, we can pay attention to all three at once. Now, you've probably noticed that racism in general can focus on body parts other than skin color, like hair, noses, height and build, or even voices. For example, when it comes to height and build, think about the racist stereotypes of Asian men as small and scrawny and black men as large and dangerous. People often assume that all these stereotypes about the different parts of a person's body will line up into one neat racial identity, such as black, East Asian, or white. But for Jews, the stereotypes about different parts of Jewish bodies can clash, making people see and treat Jews in contradictory ways. And in order to understand those contradictions, we've got to identify specific racial stereotypes about Jews. We've already mentioned the stereotype of big hooked noses. Other stereotypes are related to complexion, that Jews will have dark hair and eyes and maybe olive skin, or that Jewish hair will be dark and curly. These stereotypes are part of the reason why people struggle to believe that stars like Zac Efron or Scarlett Johansson could be Jewish. Other bodily stereotypes cast Jewish men as emasculated compared to Christian men. In the present-day US, stereotypes of Jewish emasculation tend to focus on height, build, and voice. For example, painting Jewish men as shorter, scrawnier, unathletic, and less handsome than Christian men. This is why many people find Drake and Zac Efron's muscles so un-Jewish looking. So, how do all these anti-Semitic bodily stigmas interact with skin color to create contradictory racial experiences for both Jews of color and Jews with white skin? Regarding Jews of color, one example is that black Jewish men can face opposite racial stereotypes about black hypermasculinity and Jewish emasculation. For instance, the poet Aaron Samuels has written about confronting these opposite expectations, which are both stigmatizing in different ways. And regarding Jews of all skin colors, racial anti-Semitism can include insulting stereotypes, like the notion that Jews are uglier than Christians. For example, Zac Efron has a YouTube comedy sketch where another character finds out he's Jewish and gasps,
"Get the fuck!" Whoa. Okay, whoa.
Wow.
No, you are not.
I very much am.
So you're handsome and Jewish?
as if that combination is surprising. And these insulting visual stereotypes about Jews can also appear in anti-Semitic memes or cartoons on the internet, like memes that caricature Jews as ugly and monstrous looking. And lastly, for Jews with white skin, racial anti-Semitism can intersect with white privilege and so expose Jews to an unpredictable mixture of danger and safety. For example, on one hand, Jews with white skin can experience white privilege in settings like job interviews or going through airport security. But on the other hand, white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan explicitly view all Jews as non-white and therefore target Jews for racial hatred and violence.
Will not replace us! Jews will not replace us!
One high-profile case of that anti-Semitic racial violence was the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting in 2018, which was the deadliest anti-Semitic attack in U.S. history. And before the shooter attacked the synagogue, he posted on far-right social media that he was doing this because he considered Jews a racial danger to white Christians. So this case captures how a Jewish person with white skin can experience racial danger from white supremacists, even while experiencing white privilege in lots of other settings, like in the workplace. We usually assume that a person either experiences white privilege or racial discrimination and violence, but Jews with white skin can experience both. So now you've got some tools for understanding racial anti-Semitism, meaning the stigmas that cast Jews as physically different from and inferior to the dominant majority. I hope you'll use those tools to recognize and interrupt specific anti-Semitic racial stigmas and the way they attach to body parts such as hair, muscles, and noses. Likewise, now that you can notice how anti-Semitic racial stigmas interact with skin color, you can better understand how Jews get seen and treated in real life, including both Jews of color and Jews with white skin. By better understanding these anti-Semitic bodily stigmas, we can see that we don't have to choose between challenging anti-Semitism or racism. Instead, we can notice and challenge anti-Semitism, racism, and white privilege all at once.